Seattle in winter always carried a certain gloom. The endless drizzle cast a gray shadow over everything, much like my life at the moment. Quiet, uneventful, and dull. I worked part-time at a small cafe downtown, and in the evenings, I buried myself in the unfinished manuscript of my novel. But the more I wrote, the emptier I felt. One day, while browsing an online forum for artists, I stumbled upon an ad looking for a portrait model. Seeking a portrait model. No experience required. Generous compensation. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. Without expecting much, I sent in my application. 2 days later, I received a response. The artist's name was Will Donovan. I had never heard of him before, but after a quick search, I discovered his paintings were hauntingly beautiful and strikingly vivid. There was something mysterious about them that intrigued me, pushing me to accept the meeting. Will's studio was on the top floor of an old building, bathed in natural light. As the door opened, I found myself face to face with a man whose sharp gaze held a quiet melancholy. "I'm Will," he said, his deep voice resonating in the vast space. I had no idea that this moment would change my life forever. The scent of oil paint lingered in the air as I stepped into Will's studio. The room was cluttered yet strangely harmonious, easels with half-finished portraits, shelves lined with art books, and a massive window that bathed everything in soft, natural light. The atmosphere was both inviting and intimidating. Will gestured toward a chair near the center of the room. "Sit here," he instructed, his voice calm but firm. I hesitated before settling into the chair, feeling oddly self-conscious under his gaze. He studied me in silence, his piercing blue eyes scanning my face as if memorizing every detail. Then, without another word, he turned to his canvas and began to work. At first, I didn't know what to do. Should I talk? Should I pose a certain way? The silence stretched between us, heavy and unfamiliar. My fingers fidgeted in my lap, but Will didn't seem to mind. He was entirely focused, his hand moving smoothly over the canvas. "You don't have to do anything," he finally said, as if sensing my unease. "Just be yourself." I exhaled slowly and let my shoulders relax. The rhythmic scratching of charcoal against the canvas filled the air, creating an oddly soothing effect. Time passed unnoticed, the initial awkwardness fading into something almost meditative. "Why do you paint?" I asked after a while, breaking the silence. Will paused for a brief moment before answering. "Because it's the only way I know how to understand people." His words lingered in the air, enigmatic yet deeply personal. I wanted to ask more, but something in his expression told me not to push. Instead, I let the quiet settle between us again. After what felt like hours, Will finally set his charcoal down. He stood back, tilting his head slightly as he examined his work. "That's enough for today." I stood and walked over, curious to see what he had created. The sketch on the canvas was breathtaking, raw, yet strikingly real. He had captured more than just my features. There was something deeper in my expression. Something I hadn't even realized I was showing. "It's incredible," I murmured, my fingers hovering just above the canvas. Will simply shrugged. "It's just a sketch. The real work starts now." As I left the studio that evening, a strange feeling settled in my chest. There was something about Will, about his art, that stirred something inside me. I didn't know it yet, but this was only the beginning. The following days fell into an unspoken rhythm. Every evening, I returned to Will's studio, slipping into the same wooden chair as he worked in near silence. At first, I had expected conversation, small talk, at the very least, but Will was not one for idle words. Instead, our exchanges happened in other ways. In the slight furrow of his brow as he concentrated. In the way he would pause, tilting his head as if trying to see beyond the surface. In the quiet sighs that escaped when something wasn't quite right. I watched him work, fascinated by his precision. His hands, calloused and paint-stained, moved with a quiet confidence, translating fleeting moments onto the canvas with effortless grace. He barely looked at me while sketching, as if my image already existed in his mind, waiting to be revealed. One evening, as the soft glow of the setting sun filtered through the window, I broke the silence. "What do you see when you look at me?" Will hesitated, his charcoal pencil hovering just above the canvas. "That depends," he said simply. "On what?" He finally met my gaze, his blue eyes sharp yet unreadable. "On whether you're asking what I see, or what I understand." I frowned slightly. Unsure how to respond, Will never gave straightforward answers. And yet his words carried a weight that lingered long after they were spoken. As the days passed, I grew accustomed to his silences, learning to read the subtleties in his demeanor. The way his lips pressed together when he was deep in thought. The way his fingers drummed against the edge of the easel when something eluded him. And yet, despite our growing familiarity, there was still a distance between us, an invisible barrier neither of us seemed willing to cross. One night, as I was preparing to leave, I noticed a stack of canvases leaning against the far wall. Curiosity got the better of me. May I? I asked, gesturing toward them. Will hesitated for the briefest moment before giving a small nod. Go ahead. I stepped closer, carefully flipping through the paintings. They were beautiful, portraits of people I didn't recognize, each one alive with emotion. Some gazes were filled with sorrow, others with quiet determination, but they all had something in common, an intimacy that made them feel almost tangible. Then, I reached a painting that made me freeze. It was me, not the me from the studio, sitting quietly in his chair. This version of me was different, eyes filled with something raw and unguarded. Lips slightly parted as if caught mid-thought. It was as if Will had seen a side of me I hadn't even recognized in myself. I turned to him, unsure of what to say. When did you paint this? Will looked at me for a long moment before replying. Before you even sat for me. His words sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what unsettled me more, the fact that he had painted me before truly knowing me. Or the fact that, somehow, he already did. The painting haunted me. For days, I couldn't shake the image of my own face, captured with an intimacy that felt almost invasive. How had Will seen me like that, so raw, so exposed, before I had even spoken more than a few words to him? I returned to the studio as usual. But something had shifted. I was more aware of the weight of his gaze, of the scratch of charcoal against paper, of the way silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken questions. That night, I found myself staring at the unfinished portrait he was working on. It wasn't like the first painting. This version of me was softer, less guarded, less of a mystery. Perhaps. You never asked why I paint. Will's voice broke the quiet. I glanced at him, caught off guard by the sudden shift. Why do you? He considered this for a moment, his fingers absently tracing the edge of his easel. Because sometimes words aren't enough. I thought about that, about the way he looked at people, as if searching for something beyond what they presented to the world, as if trying to understand them in a way even they might not understand themselves. Is that why you painted me before I came here? I asked. Will hesitated, then nodded. I had a feeling you would come. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? He exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words. Some people carry stories with them, even when they don't speak them aloud. You had that look. I frowned. What look? Will held my gaze, and for the first time, I felt truly seen, not just observed, but understood, like someone trying to outrun their own shadow. The words struck something deep inside me. I turned away, suddenly restless, my thoughts churning. He wasn't wrong. But how had he seen it so clearly? The next evening, when I arrived at the studio, Will was already painting, but this time, it wasn't me on the canvas. It was a woman. Her face was turned slightly downward, her expression unreadable, her hair cascading over her shoulders like dark silk. There was something achingly familiar about her, something that tugged at a place in my memory I had long tried to ignore. My stomach tightened. Who is she? Will didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the painting, his fingers flecked with color. Someone from your past. I stared at him, my pulse quickening. How do you know that? He finally turned to me, his expression unreadable. Because you look at her the way people look at ghosts. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. He was right. I hadn't seen her in years. But the memory of her still lingered in the corners of my mind, waiting for moments of quiet to resurface. She had been a part of my life once. A part one had forced myself to forget. But now, here she was, on Will's canvas, and I had no idea what it meant. I stood frozen, staring at the painting. The woman's face was so familiar, yet impossibly distant, like a dream half remembered upon waking. My mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. How do you know her? My voice was quieter than I intended, edged with something between fear and disbelief. Will set his brush down carefully, his expression calm but unreadable. I don't. My breath caught. Then how? I saw her in your eyes. A shiver ran through me. His words carried the weight of something I wasn't ready to confront. I turned away from the painting, trying to steady myself. This wasn't possible. He couldn't have known about her, about what had happened. I had buried it, locked it away where no one could reach. And yet, here she was, resurrected in layers of paint and shadow. Tell me who she is, Will said, his voice gentle but firm. I hesitated. The truth felt like a wound I wasn't ready to reopen. But part of me knew that if I didn't speak it now, it would consume me. Her name was Evelyn, I finally admitted, my throat tight. She was my sister. Silence hung between us. Will didn't react with surprise or pity, just quiet understanding, as if he had already known. Somehow, he gestured toward the canvas. She meant a lot to you. I let out a hollow laugh, crossing my arms. She was everything. The words tasted bitter. Evelyn had been my anchor, my confidant, the one who always saw through me. And then, one day, she was gone. What happened to her? Will asked. I looked away, the memories clawing their way to the surface. The accident, the phone call, the silence that followed. I had spent years running from it, pretending that if I didn't acknowledge it, the pain would fade. But it never had. I swallowed hard. She died. The words felt foreign, as if they belonged to someone else. I had spoken them before, rehearsed explanations, polite condolences, the kind of grief that people accepted because it was neat and contained. But saying it now, in this room, under Will's quiet gaze, felt different, more real. And you blame yourself, he said softly. I jerked my head up, my heart pounding. I never said that. You didn't have to. A sharp breath left my lips. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong. But I couldn't, because the truth was, I had carried that weight for years. If I had been there that night, if I had picked up the phone sooner, if I had done something differently, Evelyn might still be alive. The room felt suddenly too small, the air thick with memories and unspoken regrets. I turned away, gripping the edge of the table as if it could ground me. Will didn't press me, he simply watched, waiting. And then, in a voice so quiet I almost missed it, he said, maybe it's time to stop running. His words settled into the space between us, heavy and inescapable. I closed my eyes. Maybe he was right, but I wasn't sure I knew how. The days that followed were a blur of restless nights and unspoken thoughts. The painting of Evelyn haunted me, her eyes following me no matter where I stood in Will's studio. It was as if she was watching. Waiting, for what? I wasn't sure. I found myself drawn back to the canvas, studying the delicate brushstrokes, the way Will had captured something so intangible yet so deeply familiar. He had painted her not just as she was, but as I remembered her, radiant, yet shadowed by something unspoken. You still haven't told me how you painted her. My voice was quiet, but firm. Will glanced up from his sketchpad, where he had been idly drawing. I already told you. I saw her in your eyes. I shook my head. That's not an answer. He exhaled, setting his pencil down. Sometimes, I see things in people, memories, echoes of something they carry with them. I don't know why or how. But when I looked at you, I saw her. A chill ran down my spine. That's impossible. Maybe. He studied me carefully. But I think you've been carrying her with you for a long time. I turned away, my hands clenching at my sides. He wasn't wrong. Evelyn's absence had shaped every part of me, the way I distanced myself, the way I avoided looking too closely at the past. But this was different. There's something else, Will said, something you're not telling me. I swallowed hard. The weight in my chest was suffocating. I had spent years running from that night, from the truth of what happened. But now, standing here, it felt like the past was demanding to be heard. The night she died, my voice wavered. She called me. Will didn't interrupt. He just waited, letting me find my words. I forced myself to continue. I didn't answer. Silence. I let out a shaky breath, my nails digging into my palms. I saw it ringing. I hesitated, and then, it stopped. Will's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. I thought it was just another call. I whispered. Another one of her reckless, last-minute adventures. I figured I'd call her back in the morning. The weight of those words settled between us like a ghost. And in the morning, she was gone. The memory hit me like a wave, waking up to missed calls, to the sound of my mother's broken sobs, to the realization that I would never hear Evelyn's voice again. Will's voice was quiet, You think it was your fault. Tears burned at the edges of my vision, but I refused to let them fall. If I had answered, maybe she wouldn't have. I swallowed. Maybe she'd still be here. Will stepped closer, his gaze steady. Or maybe it wouldn't have changed anything. I shook my head. You don't understand. Maybe not. He hesitated, then said, but I do know that punishing yourself won't bring her back. I looked away. For years, I had carried this guilt like a scar that refused to fade. I had convinced myself that silence was the only way to atone for what I had done. But now, standing here, facing the past I had tried so hard to ignore, I wasn't so sure anymore. The night after my confession, I barely slept. My mind replayed the moment over and over, the ringing phone, my hesitation, the silence that followed. I had carried this weight for years, convinced that I alone bore the burden of Evelyn's fate. By morning, I felt hollow. Will hadn't pushed me for more after that night. And for that, I was grateful. But his words lingered. Punishing yourself won't bring her back. I wasn't sure if I believed that. A door left open. The next evening, I found myself at Will's studio again. Unable to stay away. The painting of Evelyn was still there. Unchanged. But something about it unsettled me more than before. It felt alive. Like she was trying to tell me something. As I stared at the portrait, I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint outline in the background, almost imperceptible beneath the layers of paint. It looked like a door. I turned to Will. Was this always here? He frowned, stepping closer. What do you mean? I pointed. The door. Behind her. Will's expression darkened. He leaned in, inspecting the canvas. That's strange. You didn't paint that? He shook his head. At least, not intentionally. A shiver ran through me. Then how did it get there? Will didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped back, regarding the painting as if seeing it for the first time. Maybe it was always there. He murmured. Maybe you just weren't ready to see it. A message from the past. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that the painting was trying to tell me something. The door. The way Evelyn's eyes seemed to focus on something just past the edge of the canvas. I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through Evelyn's things. Most of it had been packed away, but a few of her journals remained. As I flipped through the pages, I found entries I had never read before. One caught my eye. There's something I need to tell you, but I don't know how. Maybe tomorrow. The date was the day before she died. My heart pounded. What had she been trying to tell me? Had she known something? The thought sent a chill through me. I grabbed my phone and, without thinking, called Will. I need to see the painting again, I said as soon as he answered. A pause. Then, come over. The truth beneath the paint. When I arrived, Will had already moved the painting onto the easel. The dim lighting cast eerie shadows across Evelyn's face. I hesitated. I need to know what's beneath the paint. Will didn't question me. He retrieved a palette knife and, with careful precision, began scraping away the layers. Slowly, the hidden image beneath the surface began to emerge. A second figure. A man, standing just beyond the door. And I recognized him. My breath caught in my throat. It was someone I knew. Someone who had been there that night. Someone who had lied. The room felt colder as the image beneath the paint fully emerged. The man's face, once buried under layers of color, was now clear. I staggered back, my breath shallow. It was him. The memories rushed in all at once, his voice that night. His presence at the funeral. The way he had looked at me when I asked too many questions. I had never doubted his grief. But now, standing before this undeniable truth, I realized how blind I had been. He was there. He had been part of it. Will's voice pulled me back. Who is he? I swallowed hard. Marcus. Will's expression darkened. Your father's friend? I nodded. He was close to our family. He helped after she died. But I never. My voice faltered. I had never questioned why. I had never questioned him. Confronting the past, the weight of my realization pressed against my chest. Had Evelyn known? Had she tried to warn me? I reached for my phone, my hands trembling. Marcus had left town years ago, but I still had his number. I hesitated, then dialed. The call rang once, twice. Then, to my shock, he answered. A pause. Then, I was wondering when you'd call.